Hello guys, and welcome to first bundle of V-Ray for 3ds Max hosted by ReseArch. This is Stefan, and I'm going to be talking to you all this time and trying to explain to you how V-Ray works and how to get the best out of it. So as you can see here, I already have open our to-do list for this bundle. As you can see here, we have it split into three main sessions. First session, that it's called initial scene setup, is going to be this one, and then we are going to move forward with render setup dialog part 1 and part 2. It's called like this because this is simply going over the V-Ray settings, and it's actually various settings, so this is the way how I split them. But for now, let's focus on our session, and I will just give you a very quick idea about what is going to be happening here, and then I'm going to go step by step as it's written in here. So first, what we are going to do is we are going to talk a little about the concept of architectural visualization, what actually means when you want to create architectural visualization, what needs to be handled, and what all aspects it's take to complete the renders. Then I'm just going to give you some very quick idea about specifications of computer that I'm using, and also what requirements is V-Ray having for your computers. Then I'm going to introduce you to V-Ray interface, and lastly we are going to move forward to very basic scene setup, and we are going to set up our units, which is very important part, and then I'm going to import our sample scene into 3ds Max so we can start, so we have it ready for our next sessions and next procedures. So let's move on, and let me open the PDF with step-by-step presentation. Okay, so here we are, and as I mentioned you, this is first topic that we are going to cover in this session. So I named it 5 steps of ArchViz. So ArchViz is like short for architectural visualization, just to be sure about the terminology. So pretty much what you can see here is somehow 5 items that I selected that are really necessary to cover when you want to create a visualization for your project. So it's quite straightforward, but it's really good to realize this in order to not skip any important step along the path. So if we move to the next slide, sorry. You see here that highlighted is 3D model. So what I want to say about this is that pretty much you cannot create your visualization without having your environment and your building or your design being represented in a virtual space through the 3D model. So the same way as you go outside with your camera and you would take a picture of a building, or I don't know, of a bridge or an environment, the same way you need to have this represented in your virtual space. So this is why 100% you need to have your 3D model of the object of your interest that you are trying to visualize, and then you need to have also environment that is needed to have in order to create all complex image, so it's not out of context, right? So this is simply the step that you cannot skip, because you would have nothing to actually make the render of. Next step is shaders, which is pretty much bonded to the previous one, to the 3D model. So if you have a 3D model and it would have no shaders, it would mean that it would be pretty much either some gray, black or white image. So we don't want this. We want to have our renders to be appearing as realistic as it's possible, and for this you need to recreate your shaders again within your virtual space. So the same way as you have materials in a real world, wood, concrete, also plants are having leaves and bark, I don't know, asphalt on the road. So all these you need to take and you need to recreate it in your software in order to be able to achieve photorealistic result. Then another thing that is really important is lighting, because simply as you go again with your camera outside, you cannot take picture if there is no light. So there's need for proper lighting every time, and the same applies to V-Ray, where you need to have your light source. There's many options how you can set this, but for now the information that you need to have a light source, you cannot make a render without any type of lighting. This is what we need to realize. And this is also very good for troubleshooting, because it happens many times that you start rendering and everything is black and it doesn't make sense. So like you would wonder how many times it happened throughout the years that I just realized that I'm missing a light source, because it's taking so much for granted that sometimes you just forget it. So this is really important. You cannot move without this. Another item on the list is camera, which again makes sense because you cannot really make a picture without a camera unless you paint it on the canvas, which would be a different case. But in our case, we are pretty much trying to make photographs, and we are creating this with our software. So we need, again, our virtual camera inside a V-Ray in order to in a brackets take a picture. This is very similar to an actual camera if you have some DSLR. So this is exactly the same situation. You simply need to have a device for your photograph, for your picture. And the last thing on the list is actually settings, and this is something that doesn't occur in a nature, or let's say in the real world, because what we need to cover in our software, in this instance in a V-Ray, is that we need to set our own quality settings. I'm not talking now about the light settings, about the shader settings, but what we are talking about here is that what resolution we are going to have, how the edges and geometries are going to be represented, if they are going to be represented very well, with very high quality, with very low quality. And again, for example, you have also polygon counts and all these things. So the better settings you have for your model, for your shaders, for your lighting, and also for your camera, the more accurate result towards in comparison to real life situation, to real life photography, you are going to achieve. So this is on top of everything that you need to cover. This is some extra thing that it's being necessary for the architectural visualization. Right? So this is pretty much what you need to do every time that you want to get your render done. Right? So let's move on. Okay, so next thing on our list is hardware requirements for V-Ray. So let me go to my PDF again, and you can see here that I made some already specification that are written down here for you to understand that what I'm using, what is the least specs your computer should have in order to handle V-Ray and 3ds Max comfortably. So here it is. So pretty much what you need to know at the beginning is that V-Ray is a core-based engine. So what this means is that the biggest importance is put to your cores, so to your CPU. So this, until the point, from the point you realize this is how your computer should be built. So the better CPU you have, the better performance you are going to get from V-Ray. Another very important thing is to have a quite decent graphics card. because we are using Viewport in 3ds Max, and sometimes the scenes can get heavy, like with very huge polygon counts and very complicated, complex scenes. So in order to be able to orient yourself and navigate yourself in Viewport quite easily and with the freedom, you should have quite decent graphics cards also. But we are not using graphics card for main rendering, main production in a V-Ray, right? So we can use it in a sometimes when we want to do some fast tests. I will show you that later on. But for understanding, the main production in V-Ray is done by CPU, right? So if you see here, I'm having Windows 10. Processor is i7. This edition, you can check it out if you want to have more specs, but basically this is 6-core, so I'm having 6-core that it's being hyper-threaded because V-Ray is offering this option. So I'm having 6 cores, so therefore I'm having 12 buckets in the V-Ray from this computer. RAM is 32 gigabytes, which is quite enough, but for the 3ds Max and V-Ray purpose, this is actually more than enough. But if you want to have on the side open Photoshop or maybe second smaller scene in 3ds Max, 32 is starting to be actually quite little. So from the moment you want to use your machine for more than one scene or more than one process being handled at the same time, let's say rendering and post-production at the same time, you really should consider going to 64 gigabytes of RAM, because that's really going to help much actually. My graphics card is, as you can see here, GTX 960, which for my purposes, it's actually quite enough. But if I wanted to be using real-time rendering more often and in a wider range, I again would have to update this to some higher level graphics card. But for now, it's just completely fine. And SSD drive, I believe that this is nowadays quite standard. So this means that pretty much it's much more faster than HDD, because the files and all the software is being loaded much more fast from this drive than from the old HDD drive, right? And here you can check it out for the V-Ray 3.3 minimum requirements, which are actually much lower, and this is actually quite true. It would be doable also with this, but again, the higher you go, the much more comfortable you are going to get with the performance. And the same, pretty much almost the same applies for 3ds Max, right? So you can check it out, and this is also where the most of the renderings were done for the sample scene. So you can compare that, and I'm going to write times of like render times under every picture, under every render that I did, so you can have a better idea of how much it took with my computer specs. Okay, next one is V-Ray interface. So we are actually going to enter 3ds Max. Let me open it right here. This is how it looks, which I guess you know. Okay, and so what we are going to do now is that we are going to learn where are all the V-Ray tabs and buttons and shortcuts. So I'm not going to pay attention to 3ds Max environment and canvas much, only for things that are connected with V-Ray, because this is simply focused on V-Ray mostly. So I'm assuming that you are fluent enough in 3ds Max in order to be comfortable to move around, right? So what we see here in general is our viewport, which you can set to any setup as you want. And when do we start tweaking V-Ray? So pretty much by default, the V-Ray is not the render engine, the mental ray is. So how do you select V-Ray as your render engine? So what you can do, actually, the simplest way is that I'm going to jump a bit forward, and I'm going to tell you that here from the 3.0 version of V-Ray, here you have a toolbar which is dedicated only to V-Ray, and pretty much if you select any of these options, it's going to ask you if you want to use V-Ray as your current renderer. So pretty much from the moment you say yes, V-Ray is your render engine, right? So the other way would be to go to render setup, which is right here. The button for any render setup is here, and you can go all the way down here and you see assign renderer right here, and you have to go to production and select V-Ray Advanced, which we have already selected, so this is why it's not anymore in the options. Click yes, and then again you have your V-Ray selected as your render, right? So now we are able to use all the V-Ray elements that we are having available. So how can you be searching for these, or where you can find them? One very basic thing is to go simply here to Create tab here, and you can see that here we have a V-Ray rollout that is main, which are elements only that are working with only with V-Ray. For example, like a V-Ray proxy, Metaball, which is new thing from V-Ray 3.0, V-Ray Sphere, V-Ray Clipper, and so on, right? So these are the options that are only for V-Ray. But for example, if we go to lights, you can see that we have the photometric lights, standard lights, and we have our V-Ray lights, which would be plane, dome, sphere, IES, ambient, and sun. The same thing applies to cameras. We have default cameras offered by 3ds Max, and we have our V-Ray cameras. This is a little bit different when you have 3ds Max 2016, because there is the V-Ray camera set by default. So it's a little bit different, but please have in mind that I'm using 2014 because of all the updates that are done and actually updated to this version, and I'm simply not using the latest release because I'm using many plugins many plugins and scripts that are still not up to date with the 2016 version. So this is actually the reason why am I still here. Okay, so this is one way, and here you can actually search if something else is having V-Ray, but that should be pretty much all of it. And we have some system V-Ray, and I'm not going to go through all the elements. I'm not going to explain all of them because we are not going to be using everything that V-Ray is offering. This is simply focused. All the workflow is focused on the sample scene. So what am I not going to explain here might be explained in completely another set of sessions. But for now, we are going to be skipping some things because simply it's not needed for our purposes right now. Okay, so this is one way of how to be searching for V-Ray elements. Another thing is to go again. Here you have pretty much the same representation as here. It's just through the buttons and through the rollouts. So here is again Create tab, and here you can find the same V-Ray elements as we had there, and the same applies when you go to lights. You have V-Ray lights. Besides photometric and standard, we have V-Ray camera, dome, and physical one. So this is pretty much where it is. So you simply can select it, drag it out in a scene, and you have it there. And where are the shortcuts for the V-Ray? They are located here in the toolbar on the left. Here it's located by default. You can pretty much put it wherever you want by simply dragging it and placing it to your liking. You can have it flying around and so on and so on, but I will leave it here because I get used to it actually. So this is where it is. Okay, so what is actually here is with this button you are starting the production. So pretty much you are starting your render. This button is opening your V-Ray frame buffer, virtual frame buffer. As you can see here, I'm going to talk about this more in a next session. So I'm just showing you where you can find it. Here you can open render setup. This is pretty much the same button as the one in here. It's just in two positions because this is done from V-Ray toolbar. You can open also V-Ray quick settings, which is actually some presets done by Chaos Group, which are supposed to cover some specific situation, as for example exterior, interior, special effects, and studio setup. Right, so but we are not going to be using those because we are going to be creating our own setups. So, but if you want to try them out, maybe it would be useful for someone, but we are not going to touch those because we want to go much deeper than these settings. Here is shortcut for physical camera, so it's pretty much the same as the button right here. Here are shortcuts for dome camera, so you can pretty much just click here and drag it directly into your scene. Stereoscopic camera helper, same thing. V-Ray plane shortcut, right? So you can just simply go ahead and be dragging your relay planes. Instead of going to create, to V-Ray, to lights, to V-Ray, to V-Ray lights, selecting plane, you can simply go here and drag it right away, and it's actually much faster. V-Ray dome light, same thing. You don't have to select from the list, but you just simply have shortcut directly right here. So you can just simply put it in your scene and it's done. Spheres, right? And then we have a mesh light, IES. We are going to cover all those later on, but it's exactly the same situation. So just click of a button and drag it into your scene and apply. There are also here some modifiers which you first need to have selected some geometry. So let me make a box, and when you click on a modifier, it applies V-Ray displacement modifier right here. You can apply on top of it V-Ray fur and so on and so on. So this is actually toolbar, which is quite handy, and you can use it instead of going in all the create structure, and this is going to add a bit more efficiency to your workflow. So I believe that's it, and anything else that I didn't mention or that needs to be explained much deeper, I'm going to cover in later sessions. Okay, let us move to next step. And actually, to be honest, all the last three steps, that is scene setup, unit setup, and models import, is quite the same issue, because I want to tell you what is really important before you even start with your scene to be set up in the V-Ray. So what is really, again, really important step is unit setup. So if I move to next step, to next slide, you can see that I made this diagram which is explaining what is happening. It looks a bit confusing, but I'm going to explain what is happening. So before even opening this in Max, I really want you to first understand why is this so important. So what is happening in the 3ds Max, and why is it important since it's 3ds Max setting, not V-Ray setting, is simply because V-Ray is actually using the same unit setup as the 3ds Max is, right? So it really depends on what you have set in 3ds Max, because V-Ray is using it for its own calculations. So therefore it's really important to do this correctly. So what I want to tell you first is that 3ds Max is not is not working in any kind of units, meaning in this case millimeters, meters, centimeters, inches, miles, or pretty much any other. What 3ds Max is using as units is simply 1 unit. So it's not important for Max to be reading if it's meters, millimeters, or inches. What is important is how many units it is. So let me see what I mean by that. So if system units in Max are set to millimeters, that means that if I have a scene of a size of 10 meters, I will have actually 10,000 units representing this in the 3ds Max. If my scene is 100 meters big, I will have 100,000 units representing this scale. And if I have 10,000 meters, I am going to have actually 10 million units being handled by 3ds Max. And why this is important to know is that Max is able to handle only certain amount of units. You cannot go to infinite units because it's not going to behave properly, and actually proper amount of units, it's somewhere under 1 million units. I mean, the lower, of course, you can be having the units count, the better control you are going to have over your scene. And this is not only because of the calculation, but this is also for the orientation inside your viewports and all these things. So for example, if you have millimeters, you can see here that I highlighted the 10,000 units, which in our case would be the best situation to have our scale. So pretty much if you move to higher scales like 100 meters and 10,000 meters, which translated into units in a millimeter units would be simply too high, 3ds Max and also V-Ray would start having problems with your size of the scene. So what you want to do actually when you have bigger scenes than 10 meters, for example, if you have 100 meters, you simply can set your system units to centimeters, and then again, as you see here in the translation, it means that your scene is going to have again 10,000 units, because 100 meters in centimeters is 10,000 units, which is for 3ds Max, it is exactly the same situation, right? So this and this for in the perception of 3ds Max, this and this is exactly the same thing. Just for your scale, it's actually quite different, because you have here 10 meters and here 100 meters. So same applies for if you have even bigger scene, if you have some urban project or some cityscape or bigger environments, and you need really big scene. That means that you should be working actually neither in millimeters or in centimeters, but in, let's say, in meters, because now if you have 10,000 meters, which is pretty much 10 kilometers, you have again only 10,000 units. And again, I will repeat, this is exactly the same for 3ds Max as this situation and as this situation. So you really need to realize how big your scene is going to be and what your system units should be represented with, because this is really important, and you are going to actually be having errors from V-Ray if your scene is not set properly within the units, and if your scene is exceeding the size that it's actually being able to handle, and it might actually create some troubles later on. So as for example, bigger render times or some light leaks that wouldn't make sense, and it can be actually caused only by this issue. So for even better understanding, for graphic representation of this is, for example, this is 100,000 millimeters, right, which is 100 meters, and this is 100,000 centimeters. So again, the unit count, it's exactly the same, but the scale of your scene is bigger in centimeters. So for example, the amount of detail would be represented like this in millimeters. Amount of detail would be represented, actually the scale of the scene would be represented this way. And if we have 100,000 meters, you are able to handle much bigger scene. And this is actually not proportionate. It would go much more because simply it's that many times bigger. So again, 100,000 millimeters would be this big, 100,000 centimeters would be this big, and 100,000 meters would be actually even bigger than this line down here. So this is how you should be selecting your system units. And to be absolutely 100% sure, even 200% sure, because it's really difficult to correct this later on in your file, because simply this is how everything is going to be calculated. So you can fix it, but it's really actually unpleasant process because you have to be saving your settings and all this. So it's really good to get rid of this at the beginning and not have troubles later on at all. So in 3ds Max you have for metric system you have 4 options. You have kilometers, meters, centimeters, and millimeters. I selected some images to represent the scale of the scene that it's good to be handling within the each units, right? So if we look at the kilometers, it's really huge landscape. Actually, this is almost you can call it a city. This is some kind of a panorama. So you see that the distances are extremely huge. So this if we were using millimeters or centimeters, the units would be huge numbers, because this is for sure some number of kilometers, maybe tens of kilometers. So in millimeters it would be millions and millions and millions units, and that would be extremely problematic for also V-Ray and also for Max. So this is the proper scale to use with kilometers. In meters you again have quite huge objects, quite big scene, but you see that comparing it with the kilometers, it's actually quite detailed, because you are recognizing much more details in your scene, and you are focusing pretty much only on one or two buildings with some foreground, but it's still quite big scene. So this is why it's good to use meters in here. As we go to smaller details and to bigger focus on your building and on a smaller and smaller details, it's good to use also small units, because simply you don't need anymore that huge numbers of units. So this is why you can afford to be using better detail. And yes, so this scene pretty much like something like a family house or small residential building that are not having very big environments. This is actually really good to use centimeters. Maybe in these cases you could also afford millimeters. It really depends on the scene, and you can actually see it. I am going to show you exactly what I mean by all this. And lastly, here is millimeters. So with millimeters, it's good to handle like really detailed objects. Actually, pretty much this is like a product design. So you see that you can go into crazy detail, which is good also for modeling, and it's also good for your rendering. So this is pretty much how I would describe generally what unit setup mean. Now let me move to 3ds Max, and where you can find this setup is in Customize. Here is Unit Setup, and you have this dialog window popping up. And what we have here is Unit Setup first dialog window, and you can then click to System Unit Setup. And what is much more important for us, it's System Units Setup. So this is actually System Units is what Max is using is actually in this window defined, and you can see here that what was I talking about. You are defining exactly here that one unit for Max, what is going to be equal to. So now as you can see here, by default is millimeters. So now it means that our units are going to be done in millimeters. If I want to change this, you simply roll out the window and you can select any other option you want. So now we are defining that 1 unit for 3ds Max is going to be 1 meter. So this means different scale for your scene and control for Max within this scale. Right? So this is actually what is important. Another setting you have here, let's say if we select here millimeters, you can select display units, which is actually only for your for what you want to have displayed in modifiers and in the settings, mainly in the modifiers. So what this means is that actually your system units and your calculations are happening still on millimeters, because this is what we defined in here, but your units are going to be displayed as meters, because you might be comfortable with the meters more than millimeters, but your scene is requiring millimeters units, right? So I am going to show you this actually very easily. So let me confirm that. Let me create a box of size 1 to 1 to 1 meter. Okay, so now we see here that our box is having 1 meter in length, 1 meter in width, and 1 meter in height. So if I change my display units to centimeters, you see that it's exactly the same size, nothing changed, only the display units changed from meters to centimeters. So everything stayed the same. Also my system unit setup stayed the same, only the representation in here, what you can actually see, changed. So you can change this to any units you want, also to millimeters, which would be represented like this, and also to even kilometers. Just of course it doesn't make sense, but just for you to see that the translation is being handled automatically, and our system units are still having millimeters. So for Max, since this is 1 meter to 1 meter to 1 meter, means that this box has 1000 to 1000 to 1000 units. And this you can know if you set exactly the same units as you have in the system units. You see that this is 1000, 1000, 1000. So you can tell that Max is also perceiving this specific box as 1000 units, 1000 units, 1000 units. Right? So this is actually all that it takes to set your units properly. Let me actually open the scenes where I'm comparing on the model various units, in order for you to see also moving around in the viewport and how to be importing between the files in order to keep proper units still and not scaled up and down. So yes, just give me 1 second. Okay, so here we are, and this is the first time you are meeting Fat Tony. Actually, you are going to be seeing a lot of him, so I will just move on. Okay, so what I want to show you is the difference between the units when you are using millimeters, centimeters, and meters. So now, as you can see, my file is also called by millimeters, but let me just check if it's for sure set like this. So my system units are millimeters, and I'm previewing in millimeters because this is how I used to work. So I'm going to keep it in here. So as you can see, and I'm going to be rotating around, you see it's pretty fluent. And when I'm zooming in and out, you see that I'm actually able to go quite close, almost to the vertex level. So this is actually really good for the scale that I'm having. And for you to know how big the Fat Tony actually is, I can create just a very fast box, and he is approximately something like ½ meter high, right? So more or less. So this is ½ meter big model, and you see that in millimeters the movement around it's really good. So I can even, if I select some vertices, you can go actually really close and zoom in to this type of detail and have it like this. I selected by mistake also back faces, but you can actually really zoom in and even rotate around. So the navigation, it's really good in millimeters in this type of scale. I have open centimeter scene, which I let the grid to be visible on purpose, because you see here that the grid is actually staying the same. It's having the same proportions. Just I let it there for you to see the difference, right? So this is actually 10 times bigger because it's in centimeters. Let me again just make sure that everything is correct. So I'm having centimeters. And if I do the same testing in here, you can see it's quite difficult to recognize it, but the steps between are quite bigger, and it's not that easy anymore to go super close to detail, because after some point you are just going to be jumping through your zooming in and zooming out, right? So if I do the same thing in the millimeters, you are able to go actually bit closer to your detail, right? So I can go almost to just 1 point, and you cannot do this in centimeters, right? Because it's ignoring these steps. So this is one very big difference in the units that you are using. And to see this even being affected even more, if you go to meters, you see again how the grid is, so actually the proportions. And you see here that when I'm zooming, it's actually jumping much in huge steps, because simply this is half of the meter. So that means that when I am having my scene set to meters, this is not even 1 unit size, right? So this is like half of the unit big. So this is why the step is also bigger. So because meters are not dedicated for this type of detail, but for much bigger scales and scenes. But for you to believe me that this is actually really half meter, I will do the same test with the box. And you can see here in the height that it's pretty much not pretty much, but it's exactly the same height. It's quite difficult to measure him like this. So, but you see that it's half meter also in here, and it's half meter also in a centimeters, right? So the size of the fat Tony, it's exactly the same. We are just using different units, right? So okay, another thing that I want to show you is that I want to import box of a size 100 on 100 on 100 millimeters into all of these scenes to see that it is actually working properly as it should. Okay, so I go to import, merge, because this is how you are merging the files between the 3ds Max files, right? I'm going in here, essentials, initial scene, and I have here a ready-made box of 100 millimeters size. So I'm just going to import this, and it's right here, and it has open modifiers, so you see that it's 100 on 100 on 100 millimeters. So this is actually proportionate to our Tony, because we know that he's having half a meter, so you can tell that this is proper scale and proper everything. We can do exactly the same thing in the centimeters, so import, merge, and box, and we can see that it's exactly the same box as in our previous scene, because simply the units are working as they should. And in meters it will happen exactly the same thing. So now we know that everything is working as it should. And one more thing that I want to show you with this, and that's going to be all, and I believe that there cannot be any other misunderstanding about the units is that I'm actually going to show you one last setting that it's quite important. So I will leave my millimeter scene open, and there's this tiny setting actually that goes quite unnoticeable. In a system unit setup, you have this respect system units in files. So what this means that if you are opening some file that is having different system units set up than your current file, it is going to ask you if you want to use the units from the file or if you want to keep units that you have set in your current scene. So if you don't have this, it's simply going to still use every time the system units that you are having set here. This is really important because if you are using various units, which you should, if you don't use this setting, you are going to have them very mixed up. So I really recommend to have this on, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. So now we are in millimeters, and if I'm going to open the scene, sorry, actually I'm going to import. No, I have to open new scene. So don't save. I'm going to open now, let's say centimeters, and you can see here that it's asking me if I want to rescale file objects to the system unit scale, which would mean that here would happen the mix-up already, but I want to actually use the units that my file is having, which is this adopt the files unit scale. So from the moment that I see here what the transition is, and I use this, I'm certain that my units are centimeters and everything is as it should be, right? And the same thing applies to meters. So now it's asking me again my system units that are currently being set and the file units that my file is having, and I want to be using those. So I just go ahead and click OK, and everything is just fine. Okay, so this is how you should set your units. First thing, really again, very important thing for you to avoid many troubles later on. Okay, so I believe that's how well the units can be explained. I don't have any other example to give you for this. And last thing that we are going to do is that I'm just going to import our sample scene in order to have some nice background in the viewport. Okay, so last thing that I'm going to do in this session is that I'm going to import our sample scene, and I'm going to show you how to solve the problem of the units if you realize during your process that you actually need to change them. It's not a very big issue, but you need to know how to do it properly in order to avoid some trouble. So I'm just going to open my scene right here, and I'm going to pause until it opens. Okay, so here it is. Oops, sorry for that. Okay, I'm back. So you can see here this is quite final stage of the scene of everything. So this is the final state how all the scene is. And let me just check what units I have here. So if we go to system units, we were using millimeters, because if we measure the scene, of course approximately, but if we measure what we are using, it's somehow 72 meters on 72 meters. So pretty much it's less than 100 meters, which is like in millimeters it's less than 100,000 units, which I was explaining in here that it's good to have 10,000, but 100,000 it's as well as okay for millimeters, but 10 million would be too much simply. I think it's starting to have problems on millions. So it's for sure it's better safe than sorry, but 100,000 is still quite okay. But to be honest, I was hesitating if to use centimeters or millimeters, because still what you can do is that you can model your general model, like environment, in let's say centimeters or in meters, and do all the small detailed modeling like the pillows or other very detailed models that are in your scene. You can do in a separate scene and re-import that. We re-import them exactly the same way as I did in the previous step. So, but let's say that we are done in the model and we notice that we are having problem in the V-Ray. I'm going to show you that in the render window later on. So pretty much you are going to realize that you need to add, for example, more environment, which would make your scene quite big. So what is important thing is to start your modeling, or if you are importing from another software, you should really be as close to 0, 0, 0 point as you can. So if I turn on the grid by pressing a G, you see that my grid is actually meeting in here, which means that my 0, 0, 0 point is here. So my scene is centered towards the origin of my file, right? So this is actually how it should be, because how the units are calculated, they are calculated actually from this point. So anything that would appear around here would be actually counted as units. So it's not only the size of the object, but it's actually the distance, how far your object is from origin, right? So this is actually how the units are being measured, which is really important to realize, because, for example, it happens quite a lot that if you are importing some AutoCAD drawings for your modeling, it happens quite often that there are some lost shapes or lines, splines, or whatever helpers around your scene, and you simply don't know about them because it wasn't you who was doing the AutoCAD file. So you simply just need to do some fast checkup, because you might be having problems again in your viewport and in your rendering. So this is also good to realize that this can happen. But okay, let me go back to the issue that I'm trying to create here. So let's say that you need to make something in here for our background, or maybe something even in here, which would be quite far from our origin. So if I measure this now, I can see that I cannot even read that number. So it's like 1,600,000 something. And if I now go to perspective, and I'm trying to be orienting in here, you can tell that the viewport is actually being really destroyed. So this shouldn't be happening, and if this is happening, you can tell that you don't have correct units. This actually shouldn't be happening, because you cannot model and you cannot really go close, and this is not comfortable to be handling this type of scene. So when this happens, this bugging, you should re-import your scene to bigger units. So, and how to do that? You cannot simply, unfortunately, it doesn't work like this. You cannot simply change the system units now to meters and it would solve the problem, because this is how it was set from beginning, and this is what is actually being somehow baked or fixed in the max. I don't know for what reason exactly, but this is how it is. So we need to make our peace with it and solve it somehow. And how we can solve this, actually, it's quite simple. It's just quite unfortunate because there is one step that it's not very pleasant, but I'm going to tell you right now. So what you should do is you should open new 3ds Max scene, and you should reset the units to whatever units you want to have. So for example, now we want to go from sorry, we have been on millimeters, right? Because this is how it was working. we want to go to, let's say, meters. So I have to, in a fresh scene, I need to set my units to meters, which I have, and I simply need to import the scene. I'm going to save it. Okay, and it is saved. So now I am going to go to my new scene with meters. I will just double check with the meters set as a system units, and I have to merge in here. I cannot open because, as I said previously, you can be using file units or rescale. We don't want to rescale, and in this case don't want to be using the file units, but we want to merge it into this scene. So we need to find our file, which is in here, and open. Select everything by the all button that is in here. Simply hit OK. Wait a second until it loads. Yes, so it is loaded, and you see that the position of the thing is exactly the same. We are still remaining in the origin. So from the moment you merge it this way, you don't have to place it on your own. It's placed automatically. So this is actually really good. And let me check if we have a better preview, and you can see that it's no more the not pleasant bugging happening, and this is proper unit setup for this scale. So we fixed all the preview. Now you can actually be moving around and zooming in comfortably, and all your geometry is being previewed just fine. Of course, from the moment that now we are in the meters, it's quite difficult to zoom into the details, as I showed you previously. But this is okay. Actually, this is good that this happened, because I'm going to tell you what happened. Yes. So what happened in here? Let me finish what I was saying. So this is why I was saying that sometimes it's good to do small details in the file where you have millimeters or centimeters as the units, and import them later on to your bigger scale where you're using meters if you need to have very big environments and stuff like this. So what happened in here actually is that some modifiers that I was using in the model are not being baked. So this is modeling issue, so I don't want to spend much time with this. But for some bit of troubleshooting, if everything was baked, if all the geometry was baked, nothing would happen. The model would be done just fine. But from the moment that I'm using, for example, quad chamfer, quad chamfer is by default and by its own algorithm using millimeters. So it's being scaled up. So everything else is done correctly. Just quad chamfer. If I divided by 1000, since we went from millimeters to meters, it's going to have proper scale. So let me, since I have a mount here, number 3, I can enter 0.003, and this is actually how the modifier should look. So this happens with some plugins and some modifiers, not with all of them. This is a little bit issue, but this is 3ds Max issue, so I don't want to pay much attention for this, but you should know it because this is important also for V-Ray to have proper units. So this is why I'm mentioning it. Same issue happened here. So let me fix also this to show you that it's working properly, right? So this is how it should be, also in here. Sorry. Right, so it's fixed. And we have it also in here. So this, I need to introduce 3 more zeros. So this is how it should be appearing. Okay. So, and you can see that, for example, I have open shell modifier, and this is being translated just fine because it's built-in modifier in the Max, but quad chamfer is external plugin, so maybe this is the reason why it's not being adjusted to this. We have also some craziness happening here, and it's again the quad chamfer, so I can fix it like this. So this is quite tricky, but I'm telling you, if you would collapse the geometry, there would be absolutely no issue, which I actually can show you very fast. I will just pause for you not to wait. Okay, so I'm back to my millimeter scene, and this you can do actually when you are done with the modeling and you just realize that you have a bigger environment that originally you thought, so you need meters. So you can take all your scene and just simply collapse it, or you can convert it all together to poly, but I have selected also the cameras. So you can simply filter to select only geometry and convert all of it to poly. So that means that all the modifiers are going to be baked or collapsed to geometry. So if you remember this, we were having modifier on top of it, which we don't have anymore. So I can save it now this way. Okay, saved. So now I'm going to open again my scene with the meters. I have this open 2 times, so I will just open new scene in here, new. Okay, we have new scene. We will set units to meters. Yes. And I'm actually going to wait until it loads so you can believe me that I didn't do anything afterwards. So it will be just a little bit of waiting, but I want you to see that now there is not going to be issue with the modifier because we have no more modifiers. Everything was being collapsed. So I'm going to select all and wait just a second until it loads. Actually, it's really good that it happened because these things are happening during the usual workflow, so you should be able to be handling this. And I'm actually going to try to focus on these issues. So if I go in here on top view, you can see that not anymore we have the issue with the modifiers because they are not there anymore. The geometry is exactly the same. We just baked it or collapsed it, if you will. So just to be sure, our system units are meters, and to check the buggy effect that we had on the boxes, it's not there. So everything is nice and properly set. Okay, so this would be end of first session, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.